All right, this is a screencast for a presentation on slavery in the antebellum South. You remember, antebellum means before the war, and you'll see the subtitle there, On the Road to the Civil War. Make sure you have your notes open, which come along on this assignment. Make sure you follow it and stop this presentation as you need to, so you could keep up with notes. You should be working with a partner A or B, and if you have an additional partner, please find room to put your information in the notes also. And email me if you have any questions. So the big idea, we know that that race, being black, was a necessary characteristic of being a slave in America. But race-based slavery had a significant impact on people who were not slaves. Not all African Americans in America were slaves in 1850. But these people lived a very interesting and kind of precarious life, living in a society that saw Africans as clearly biologically less. And the church was a very important institution to help these people manage at very difficult times. Meanwhile, slave rebellions became increasingly feared by whites. And the Underground Railroad, which we'll look at the end, was not a political attack on slavery, but really an attempt to free individuals from slavery. And actually, we're going to conclude with a look at a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this book, a piece of fiction, is going to have a big piece of information, a big influence on this period of time we're looking at. So in question one, give me one thing that you know about this presentation, looking at this, and if something might be new to you. Put that down as question one, and you can stop this and as we move on to question two. Not all blacks were slaves in America. About a 500,000 were evenly distributed in the North and the South, about 250,000. But they still lived in a society that held racist arguments about the biological inferiority of black Americans. So if you live in a society and seen as an inferior, you know that access to all the opportunities of white Americans was denied, even if you were a free black. Even those who opposed slavery, some of them favored sending blacks back to Africa. It wasn't as if they wanted to integrate, they simply just saw it was wrong to own slaves. And successful free blacks and their success was a stark kind of a contrast, or kind of say it was a challenge to the idea of their racial and biological inferiority. And white racists who lived in those neighborhoods were often jealous of their success and would sabotage it out of jealousy. Nobody wanted to find a racial inferior doing better than them in life. Meanwhile, free blacks were always possible caught by slave catchers, and they had no right to go to court to oppose them being sold back into slavery. So generally speaking, not being able to be on a jury, not owning guns, among other denies of right, could not vote, free blacks were denied the freedoms of white people. But these people would often turn to churches, and one very important historical church for the black community was the AME, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Most big cities today still have AME churches, and they're primarily black churches. And while they, being Christian, put them in the accepted kind of framework for America at that time, it was a chance for them to kind of connect the Christian message to the idea of freedom and certainly of resiliency, of managing to deal with the hardships of being black in a society that saw you as a social and racial inferior. You could stop that right now if you want to finish question two. Now, number three looks at this slide right here, that rebellions were constantly feared by people in Southern society. Slave society sat on a dynamite of successful slave rebellions, that you have people there held often against their will with brutal force. And brutal force will be opposed when it comes to that with brutal force. Even before, in the early days of the American Republic, there was a slave rebellion in Haiti that actually overthrew the government and took it over. Not long after the beginning of America. It was the second independent republic in North America. There was rebellions by Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, and they spread regionally. And slave rebellions basically really sat as a real threat to the social and political order of the South. I mean, people were killed by slave rebellions. So as the fear of slave rebellions became larger, and news like rebellions like of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner came out, there was increasing brutality used to try to keep slave rebellions down. The black codes as we progressed through the early 19th century, became increasingly restrictive, more brutal. News of a successful slave rebellion could inspire more slaves to rebel. And so, one of the things that we see in slavery in the South is forbidding Africans to read. Anything that connects them to the larger society might be seen as an affront. This will help you answer question 3, the idea of slave rebellions and its impact on how slavery would operate in the South. The debate became increasingly difficult. We talked about this before. Slavery was becoming more valuable as an economic or labor system in the South, where it was becoming more opposed in the North. William Lloyd Garrison, the man we read about, publicly burned the Constitution because it permitted slavery. He was nearly beaten to death for his vocal and emotional opposition to slavery. Even in the North, the idea of ending slavery was not universal by any stretch of the imagination. Meanwhile, freed or escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass, who came north, provided really shining examples about how the racist base of slavery, that is, that Black Americans were not capable of intellectually or spiritually or whatever by living on their own. People like Frederick Douglass were really kind of important examples for the abolitionists to show that this was indeed a piece of convenient fiction. Meanwhile, in the Southern congressmen were able to work on the floor of the Congress to actually even forbid any discussion of slavery. It was called a gag order. So we're going to take a look at this slavery debate became more prone to extreme acts of violence. And meanwhile, the South was digging in its heels and working harder to try to stop any kind of opposition or any discussion. Even the discussion that would provide hope to slaves was dangerous when it came to slave rebellion. Okay, you want to stop this and look at look at question number 4. The more how it became more contentious and more violently supported. Questions 5 and 6 deal with the Underground Railroad. Now, whereas abolitionists and the Underground Railroad shared the same hatred of slavery, the Underground Railroad was an attempt to kind of chip away at the institution by trying to end slavery one slave at a time. What it really wasn't underground, so to speak, but they were networks and paths of stations where Africans, along with their conductors or people who guided them north, would find friendly houses to find cover. Because remember, we're walking at this point. You're not taking a train or you're not driving a car. So moving from Mississippi or from Alabama was quite a distance. And you did so in a society that was mobilized to protect the institution of slavery. So you had to avoid slave catchers. People who lost slaves were losing very expensive assets, and they would go to great lengths to try to find those slaves and bring them back, and where they would be whipped as a symbol for other slaves not to try it. Now, if they were able to cross the Mason-Dixon line between Pennsylvania and Maryland, or move north of the Ohio River where slavery was illegal, they still weren't guaranteed safe passage because slave catchers would go across the border and attempt to bring them back. The ultimate destination for many of these people were in Canada. Because of Pennsylvania's place near Canada, a lot of slaves in the path of the Underground Railroad often crossed our area, our region in northwestern Pennsylvania. You'll see on the right there's a plaque which you can find in Meadville. It's at the AME Church, right across from St. Bridget's Church in Meadville. It talks about Richard Henderson, who was born a slave, who himself escaped. He was a barber and also was active in the Underground Railroad. So basically, he would hide slaves in Meadville, and those slaves would eventually move northward through Waterford and perhaps cross Lake Erie to Canada, where the slave catchers could not get them anymore. There's an interesting story how slave catchers were in Meadville attempting to find somebody, but a crowd of people surrounded the slave, and he escaped in the crowd and then moved northward. There are some stations in Waterford, people who would stay in attics because, again, this was illegal property. They were stealing. So this had to be concealed. That's why we call it the Underground Railroad. Now, one of the heroes of the Underground Railroad you'll read more about later is Harriet Tubman. She was a fearless conductor who was able to take her knowledge of the geography of the South, her being an escaped slave, and was able to facilitate the escape of hundreds or maybe thousands of slaves north into freedom. Okay, so this is question 5 and 6. You can work on that and then start it up again. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a piece of fiction. It was a fiction, yet how could a fiction, a book that's based on made-up characters, change American history? That happens a number of times. We'll see that a little bit later on. But Tom's Cabin deals with a primary character who is Uncle Tom and his relationship with a brutal slave owner known as Simon Legree. Harriet Beecher Stowe had seen runaway slaves wrestled away in Cincinnati, where she was, and decided that she would write a book that would just kind of dramatize the relationships that she saw, because herself she felt terrible and guilty about what was happening to human beings under the guise of slavery. So the protagonist was Uncle Tom. He was a dutiful and loyal slave. He knew his place. He loved his master, did what he was said. But then when he was sold to a brutal master, Simon Legree, the story takes a turn. Now, this story really inspired the moral basis of slavery. And many people reading this book after they were done began to think of something that seems common sense to us today, is that Africans living in slavery were human beings. Many in the South saw this as kind of an outright outrage. They said that it was a biased approach to what slavery looked like. They said it was like a book that said marriage to be illegal because it featured, husbands beating their wives. That it was not I could say, a very honest approach. It was a biased approach. Yet it was a book that made a lot of people in the North tilt toward the abolitionist cause, at least be less tolerant of slavery. It's said that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe at the beginning of the Civil War and was said to have remarked, "Is this the little lady that caused the war?" To get a better perspective of this book, there's an excerpt. The link is also along with this assignment. It's at the bottom of the assignment. It's about a page or so it's a small piece of the novel. It gives you a picture of the characters and the storyline. It helps you understand what Harriet Beecher Stowe was trying to do, how she depicted slavery. And as you read it, I want you to think about, why would a Southerner who believed in slavery be incensed, be angered by this depiction? And why would a person in the North, like an abolitionist, be encouraged by it? So how could a novel further excite the public when it came to the debate on slavery? So I've given you the overview of the book, but how about you see it for yourself and read a piece of Uncle Tom's Cabin and make some claims. What are some things the book tries to do? And give me evidence. Show me parts of the story that support that claim. And that's question number 7. Look over your notes and check your partner, so make sure we understand what we're looking at. We're looking at how how racism in America impacted free blacks as well as enslaved blacks, who made up a majority of the black population in the country. How slave rebellions made slavery a more dangerous game, and certainly one that needed a more brutal repression to keep in place. How the debate of slavery became more contentious, as we've talked about that. And then how the Underground Railroad managed to deal with this, and how our part of the country, Meadville and Cambridge Springs and Waterford, were part of it. And then Uncle Tom's Cabin, a piece of fiction that kind of summarizes or humanizes the story of slavery. After we've done this, we have a reading that will kind of go along some of this, providing some more details. Okay, hope you had a good time with this. Please email me if you have any questions.